How do you actually kill something that destroys you the second you look at it? Back in 1587, Poland had to deal with this exact problem in Warsaw. There was this creature, the Warsaw Basilisk, living in a deserted cellar, and it had a very specific way of handling intruders. It could kill a person just by looking into their eyes. One glance, one stare, and you're done. You just turn to stone instantly. Now, this isn't just some local ghost story. The power of the gaze was so feared that even William Shakespeare brought it up. His character, Anne Neville in Richard III, wishes for the eyes of a basilisk to take out her husband's murderer. And the creature itself? It's a grotesque hybrid. It doesn't look like anything you'd find in a zoo. We're talking the head and chest of a rooster, eyes that burn with hellish fire, leathery bat wings, and a long, scaly dragon tail. It's a terrifying image, but the solution to the problem was, and I mean this, remarkably absurd. To beat a monster that kills with a look, they took a condemned man, dressed him in a suit made of hundreds of small mirrors, and sent him into the dark. This is the Warsaw Basilisk legend, where a death sentence meets a very strange fashion choice. Warsaw in the 16th century wasn't exactly a city of wide boulevards. Around Krzywe Koło Street, the layout was basically a mazy underworld, narrow alleys and deep, interconnected basements. It was claustrophobic. If you were walking those streets back then, you weren't just on a road, you were essentially hovering over a network of dark voids. One specific tenement house on Krzywe Koło Street, or Crooked Wheel Street, became the center of a very particular kind of local dread. The people living there discovered something had moved into their cellar. And no, it wasn't a leak or a pest problem. It was a basilisk. To get a feel for that basement, you have to consider the smell. The air didn't just smell like damp stone or old dust. It smelled of sulfur and decay. That's the scent of something that definitely does not belong in a residential neighborhood. It's the smell of a biological mess rotting in a confined space. So you've got a damp, dark hole under a house, and inside is a creature that turns people to stone while emitting a stench of sulfur. It's a pretty efficient way to make sure nobody ever wants to visit the basement. There was a man named Marco, also known as Macaropius, who learned that the cellar of a ruined house had basically become a mass grave. This building had been in ruins for 30 years, a silent shell that everyone should have just avoided. But two children, about 5 years old, Marco's son and a neighbor's daughter, decided to go inside. They didn't get far. Both children died the same day, right there on the lowest steps of the cellar. When they didn't come back, Marco's wife sent a maid to wake them up. She went into the cellar, found the kids, and, well, she died right there beside them. At this point, the city authorities had to step in. By order of the consul and senate, they had to drag the bodies out using fire hooks, which are basically just long poles with iron hooks on the end. And this is where it gets clinically unpleasant. The bodies didn't look like normal deaths. They were swollen like drums, with dark purple skin and bulging tongues. But the eyes were protruding as large as half a hen's egg. And this wasn't just one bad day. People had been disappearing in the cellars of Krzywe Koło Street for a while. Servants going for wine, soldiers looking for treasure, wealthy merchants driven by greed for buried gold. They all went in. When they were finally found, they weren't just dead. They were cold, gray statues. Warm flesh turned into rigid marble. Even the children of a local knife seller went missing, which sent the mother and nursemaid into a frantic search. In that part of the city, the basement wasn't for storage. It was a collection point for human stone. Since these deaths defied normal medicine, the city senate brought in an expert, Benedictus, a physician to the king who was into, let's say, arcane subjects. He didn't just look at the bodies. He examined the scene with the kind of detachment you only get from a man who spends his life studying the strange. Benedictus decided a basilisk lived in the cellar. He didn't actually see the monster, but he saw the evidence. To him, the air was poisoned by the creature's breath. Simple diagnosis: the environment was lethal because a basilisk was in the room.
Now, here's the problem. You can't just walk into a room and kill something that kills you by looking at it. So Benedictus proposed a solution that sounds more like a weird art project than a military strategy. He suggested the basilisk could be killed if it saw its own image in a mirror. His plan? Send someone into the cellar covered in mirrors facing every which way. The idea was to turn the monster's own weapon against it. If the creature looked out and saw a reflection, it would essentially execute itself. It was a clean, logical plan, assuming you could find someone willing to wear a suit of glass and walk into a dark, sulfurous hole in the ground. Before the Senate could even move, some brave knights and mercenaries tried to clear the cellar. They brought swords and shields, relying on brute force. They failed miserably. They couldn't get close enough to strike without taking a single glance at the monster, and, predictably, the result was just more stone statues. Since the problem was a gaze, the solution had to be non-physical. That's where John Ferrer comes in. He was a prisoner under a death sentence, Polish or Silesian, depending on who you ask, and he was offered a full pardon if he could go down there and capture the basilisk. The preparations for John Ferrer were like a very specific, very lethal fashion show. First, they covered his entire body in black leather. To make sure he didn't accidentally look at the creature, they actually fastened his eyelids down over his pupils. His eyes and mouth were further shielded by large eyeglasses. Then they sewed a mass of tiny mirrors all over the outside of the leather suit, from head to foot. He carried an iron rake and a blazing torch. Just think about that image. A man, effectively blindfolded, shuffling into a damp basement while wearing a suit of mirrors. Now there's another version of this story. In this one, the hero isn't a prisoner, but a young journeyman tailor named Milcher, also called Jan Schlazak. He was small, not a fighter, but he had a big heart. He didn't use a weapon, he just used a psychological solution. He covered his clothes in dozens of small mirrors and carried a large, polished mirror as a shield. He didn't need a sword, he just needed to be a human reflection. Regardless of who did it, that mirror suit changes everything. Once you descend into the dark, the monster's own weapon becomes its executioner. John Ferrer didn't exactly walk into the dark, he tinkled into it. I mean, really? A man covered in leather and small mirrors, shuffling through a 16th century basement? He couldn't see where he was going. Remember, his eyelids were taped shut, so he just relied on the smell of sulfur and the flickering light of his torch. He passed the first cellar, but the beast wasn't there. He eventually found the basilisk in a niche of the wall in a second cellar, which was partially blocked by rubbish. It was a tight, claustrophobic space. The air felt heavy. Ferrer didn't try to have a sword fight. He just used the iron rake to pull the creature out of the darkness and into the daylight. He didn't need to see the monster. He just needed the monster to see him. As the rake gripped the neck of the creature, it was dragged screaming into the open. Then the reflection happened. The basilisk looked into the mirror and saw itself. In a moment of pure irony, the creature was paralyzed by its own image and immediately turned into a heap of dead stone. The weapon wasn't steel or fire, it was a mirror. The most lethal gaze in Warsaw had been defeated by a piece of glass and a man who was about to be executed anyway. Once the creature was dragged into the light, the sheer scale of the terror was a bit of a letdown. We're talking about a creature the size of an ordinary fowl. A chicken, essentially. Looking at it, the thing was just a mess of contradictions. It had a head like an Indian, with a crown-like crest, partly blue, that sat on its head like a tiny, arrogant blue crown. Its eyes were like a toad's, wide, unblinking, and completely out of place. Then there was the body, a tawny tinge dotted with speckled spots, and the tail? The tail curved back and bent over its body, yellowish underneath and toad-colored at the end. The whole thing was covered in these colorful hues, mimicking various poisonous animals. It's just a strange thing to process. A man in a suit of mirrors risking his life to fight a bird-sized toad chicken? An animal that looked more like a collection of random poisonous colors than a legendary monster. The contrast between the lethal gaze and the physical reality was underwhelming, to say the least. Let's look at the cellar. In poorly ventilated medieval basements, you can get high concentrations of methane or carbon dioxide. A person walking into that would lose consciousness and die in minutes. Then, without oxygen, rigor mortis sets in, and the body stays stiff. To a panicked 16th century citizen, they look like statues. That's the deadly gas theory. But the monster isn't just a gas leak. The basilisk legend was probably fueled by people finding prehistoric fossilized bones. When they found the remains of a woolly rhinoceros or a mammoth, they didn't have a paleontology textbook. They just had a monster. They'd see a strange curved bone and assume it was a beast that could kill with a glance. To them, a mammoth's tusk was just evidence that prehistoric snakes existed. And that's how it works. We put our rubbish and our deadly gases in the cellar, the deepest part of the house, and then we're surprised when a monster lives there. It's a very straightforward process. Pliny the Elder wrote about this in 79 AD. He described the basilisk as a creature that likes dry, sandy climates and has a crest on its head like a diadem. He claimed the beast slithered with part of its body raised in the air, moving loftily, which made it different from normal snakes. He even wrote that the basilisk could rout other snakes just by hissing at them and used its breath to scorch rocks and bushes. It's called the Little King because it's the ruler of all reptiles. Latin, Regulus. Greek, Basiliscus. It's got royal status among monsters. But the appearance changes depending on where you are. Sometimes it's a giant snake. Sometimes a small crown-crested snake. Sometimes a rooster with a serpent tail. Some descriptions throw in bat wings for good measure. And it's not just the gaze. The beast is supposedly extremely venomous. In the Libyan region, people believed the venom remained potent even after the basilisk was dead. Its touch was as acidic as the strongest poison, and its breath could wither entire fields of crops. Pliny wrote this all down as if it were biological fact, and we're just supposed to accept it? Then there's the birth process, which is just a mess. A basilisk is born when a cockerel hatches the egg of a snake or toad. In Polish folklore, this is an egg laid by a 7-year-old rooster, which then has to be incubated for 9 years by a toad or snake in the filthiest cellar available, sometimes on a dunghill. The resulting egg is either yolkless or just peculiarly shaped. Medieval bestiaries describe it as a chimera, half serpent, half cockerel. Most often, it's a rooster with a snake's tail. So, how do you kill a king of serpents? Leonardo da Vinci noted that weasels are immune to the stare and the venom. Apparently, the smell of weasel urine is so strong that a basilisk can't survive it. Weasels and roosters are the only animals that can actually kill them. Also, the crow of a rooster can turn a basilisk to ash.
Alchemists, of course, were the most optimistic. They believed the ash of a basilisk was the key to turning silver into gold, or creating a philosopher's stone. If you look at the earliest descriptions, the basilisk closely resembled a cobra. It's a monster that evolved from a biological reality into a hypnotic hallucination of a royal toad-eyed beast. Basel, Switzerland, decided the best way to stop invaders was to put the creature's image everywhere. They have fountains with basilisks all over the city. It's a very specific choice of civic branding. There's a chronicle from Basel about a man who found a rooster that laid an unusually long egg. He killed the bird and burned 3 other eggs. Honestly, that's a logically consistent response to a bird that violates every law of biology. Then you've got the cockatrice. In medieval books, the cockatrice is almost the same as the basilisk, but the birth process is flipped. The basilisk comes from a snake's egg. The cockatrice comes from a cockerel's egg hatched by a snake. It's a very small distinction in a very lethal situation. You can even find this confusion in Old English Bibles. In Isaiah 14:29, one version says basilisk, another says cockatrice. One version of the truth, 2 different names for the same thing that kills you if you look at it. If you visit Warsaw's Old Town today, the monster is still there. Oh yes, it hasn't moved from its basement, mind you, but it's gone from a lethal predator to a tourist attraction. You'll see signs, statues, murals. There's even a restaurant named after it. The statue is described as menacing, which is a funny way to describe a beast that was defeated by a man in a mirror suit. Beyond Warsaw, the basilisk is all over literature. Voltaire described it as a rare source of medicine for a dying lord. Poets like Alexander Pope and Percy Bysshe Shelley kept the legend alive. Charles Dickens used the basilisk to describe a character named Mix in Barnaby Rudge, which is a very specific way to describe a person. Bram Stoker used the idea of the lethal gaze to reflect Dracula's own power. And more recently, J.K. Rowling put the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets. The world is just obsessed with creatures that kill by looking. Of course, the reality is a lot less glamorous. The mongoose, a relative of the weasel, is a natural predator of cobras. It's just a very specific predator-prey relationship. No stone turning required. In the end, the tragedy of Warsaw's cellars was solved not by a sword, but by a reflection. We started with a nightmare. Children and maids found as drum-swollen corpses with eyes the size of hen's eggs, and adults turned into rigid gray marble. The solution was just as surreal. A condemned man, essentially blindfolded in a leather suit that tinkled with every step, shuffling through a sulfurous void. And the prize for all this terror? A toad-eyed, bird-sized creature with a tiny blue crown, looking more like a confused poultry experiment than the king of serpents. The most lethal gaze in Polish history was neutralized by a piece of glass and a man who was already scheduled for execution. It's a nice thought that the basilisk might have been terrified of the man in the mirror suit, or maybe it was just surprised to finally see how ridiculous it looked.